So I'll be talking about two things pretty briefly today. I'll be talking about the rise of ride-sharing in Europe, and I'll also be talking a lot about trusted community and trust and online trust, and mostly how online trust has enabled ride-sharing and what we do in Europe. But before I do that, I just wanted to sort of go back in past and sort of remember the 70s, which I guess most of us in the audience actually were not even born in the 70s. But we all know that in the 70s, it was pretty common to do that, right? It was pretty common to hitchhike and just stand on the side of the street, put your thumb up, and people would stop and give you a ride for free. And if you think of nowadays, whether it's in America or in Europe, I mean, for me, having traveled in France, UK, or America, you don't really see people doing that anymore, right? It sort of disappeared. So I guess the key question for us was, what happened to hitchhiking? Why are people not doing that anymore? And clearly it went away, right? So we started to think about that and why people are not hitchhiking anymore and why they're not using that mode of transport anymore. And I guess we came up with some pretty basic answers. I mean, the first thing was, well, maybe you end up with guys like that in your car, right? So it smells bad, and you end up with two weird guys and a cat. And I guess what it says is maybe the lack of information, the lack of user profile, the lack of information about members meant that over time actually it was not sustainable, because why would you want to carry these two guys in your car? So clearly that was one reason for hitchhiking to probably die off after the 70s. Another one actually, it's kind of what these guys are doing, was back then the assumption of hitchhiking was pretty much that it was free, or at least you didn't know whenever you pick up a passenger, you don't know if that passenger is actually going to pay, or is going to contribute, or there is no agreement actually between the driver and the passenger when you go hitchhiking. So at some point you wonder if maybe it just died off because your drivers start thinking like, okay, what's in it for me? If I'm not actually making money out of that, if I don't get any contribution out of sharing my car with a stranger, why would I do it? And then the thing I love is actually whenever you Google hitchhiking online, actually, you find two kinds of pictures. Actually, you find naked girls on the side of the street, or you find this photo actually, which is blurry, with this guy hitchhiking with an axe. And for those I think who lived or studied in the US or in the UK, where I think it's especially true, they tell you at a pretty young age that don't pick up an hitchhiker. Don't ever pick up an hitchhiker because they're all axe murderers. And they also tell you that don't ever hitchhike because all the drivers actually stopping to pick up hitchhikers are also axe murderers. So I guess one theory is maybe it was just axe murderers picking up axe murderers, and at some point they disappeared. But one thing is for sure, right? If you look at hitchhiking that was so popular in the 70s, it kind of died off in the 80s. I mean, I have my dad telling me that in the late 60s or 70s he went all across Europe for free, actually, in Greece, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, and just hitchhiking. Today you cannot do that, right? I mean, if you stand on the side of the street in Paris and try to hitchhike, you're probably not going to go very far, actually. So if you look at what happened, and if you put that on a graph like this one, actually hitchhiking, or this need of sharing a ride, started pretty early on. It started in the 50s and 60s, and it started because cars were expensive. So it started because the car ownership was not very high, and it was like a pretty unique object. Few people had cars, so it made sense to share a ride. And then it really peaked during with the hippies in the 70s, and it completely died off in the 80s or 90s, and actually it never came back, right? So if you think of it, you don't see that many, and I don't know how it is here in Poland actually, but in most countries it's pretty rare to see people hitchhiking anymore. But something else happened. So something that happened actually not with the internet, but really that happened in the last sort of 3-4 years, which is really what now we call sort of ride sharing, or or C2C ride sharing or C2C car sharing. And that really took off in the last 3-4 years, and mostly in Europe. And it was really on the back of trusted community. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this discussion, is really how trust has enabled ride sharing. So the key here is ride sharing actually really took off in the last few years. So it's not something that replaced hitchhiking. So it was not like an offline to online transition. It was really a new activity that started with a new generation. If you think of hitchhiking, it was really the baby boomers and the hippies of the 70s doing that. It died off, and then it's really sort of the Y generation, the 18 to 30-year-old today, that do online ride sharing. And it's different. It's different because unlike hitchhiking, it's planned. So it's something you typically do on a website, and you're going to book your seat in a car in advance. So essentially, you have knowledge of when you're going to travel. It's paid. So today, all the online ride-sharing websites or car-sharing websites, you actually, as a passenger, you actually pay for your ride, and the driver actually knows how much he's going to get. And I guess what I mean by it smells nice, or it smells nicer, is you know who you're going to travel with, right? I mean, today we have the Open Graph, we have lots of social networks, we have lots of social information. So actually, in communities, in most like online communities, actually, you can tap into a wealth of information about who people are. I mean, their photo, the music they like, where they live, their age, and all that stuff, right? So it clearly completely changed the dynamic, and it was not a replacement for hitchhiking. It was really a completely new phenomenon. So I guess I'll just quickly describe what's ride sharing, and also just show you in a few figures actually how significant it has become in Europe in the last few years, which people might not realize. But it's a fundamental disruption to the way we travel. So it's really disrupting the transport industry in many ways. So concept, I think you all understand, it's pretty simple. So it's an example actually from the UK. So today, if you drive alone in your car between, let's say, London and Manchester, which is 200 miles, 350 kilometers, the real cost actually of making that trip today is about 90 pounds, right? So it's 100 euro, probably like 400 zloty. So that's the real cost of like petrol, maintenance of the car, depreciation of the vehicle, insurance, da-da-da-da-da. So it's all these things actually costing a lot of money. So the basic concept is, why don't you make use of this idle inventory? Why don't you make use of those empty seats? And essentially that's the concept of all the ride-sharing websites like ours, like BlaBlaCar, was making use of this inventory. And as a driver, you can offer those empty seats to passengers going the same way. And you end up with a pretty compelling equation where the driver is actually going to make money or completely offset his or her cost, and the passengers are going to travel for probably a third of a train ticket. And especially in the UK, I mean, you don't pay 30 pounds actually to travel between London and Manchester. Now, in terms of, well, before I talk about scale, I mean, the basic concept, most ride-sharing websites looks like BlaBlaCar, I mean, which is our website, but basically it's a combo between a travel search. So essentially, if you go on these websites, you're just going to be looking for rides. Essentially, the same way you would be looking for a bus or a train or a plane. But the fundamental difference is there are no trains or planes, and there are no assets. Right? Essentially, the key difference here is it's all people-powered. We just make use of empty cars traveling around, which is pretty powerful because essentially what you do is you create a new transport network based on an existing asset. So it's very efficient. Now, in terms of scale, I mean, the old ride-sharing, and I'm just sharing some new numbers about our community, but it's probably a good proxy of ride-sharing in general in Europe. So today, our community is over 3 million people in Europe and growing pretty fast. We passed 3 million actually a couple of months ago. And what we count is we count the number of kilometers shared by the community. And today we passed 2 billion miles actually, so 3.2 billion kilometers shared on the road by people ride sharing. So to give you a sense of scale, that's 80,000 times around the Earth, which is pretty massive. And we should pause that for a minute because it's really disrupting the transport industry in a way. And there was an article, I think it was just a month ago, on the leading French newspaper, like the equivalent of the New York Times in France, which is called Le Monde. And they said actually ride-sharing is now putting pressure on the national rail company because they need to lower their price. Because today you can travel for like a third of the train everywhere in France, Spain, Italy, and more recently in Poland. So it's a new transport network. So today, ride-sharing carries probably more than 600,000 passengers per month, right? Which is more than more than a lot of bus companies and even sometimes like local train companies. And since we started the website, we had 23 million seats actually offered on the community, which I guess is like half the population of Poland. So it's a massive capacity of seats that you can unlock, and you can enable people to travel all across Europe, creating like a completely people-powered transport network. And we have a pretty massive seat capacity. I mean, today we have more than 2 million on the website today. Actually, we have more than 2 million seats available. And probably if you add up like all the ride-sharing websites in Europe, that's probably, I don't know, maybe 2 times that. I don't know, but it's like several millions of seats actually available for people to travel. So clearly, it's an interesting phenomenon, and for us it was almost surprising that it worked. I mean, when we started the concept 5 years ago, people said it's never going to work. I mean, people stopped hitchhiking like 30 years ago, and you're just going to get like 100,000 people to do that in Europe, and there's just going to be like backpackers and weird guys. And I guess 3 million people later, we were even surprised that it worked so well. And the key, and that's where I want to focus for the rest of the discussion and just broaden the discussion to trust. The key here was really trust, online trust, and trusted community. And that's really how all these activities, and not just ride sharing, but also flat sharing, with companies like Airbnb, that's how this thing actually was cracked, is by creating online trust, trusted community, and transparency within your community. So if you go back to basics of what do we trust, and especially what do we trust online, so that's a survey from Nielsen, actually from just a year ago, so it's pretty recent data. And what we see is the trust in ads and TV and radio and sort of traditional media is just dropping dramatically. And the trust in online ratings is going up. And what it means fundamentally, it means essentially trust in brands and corporate brands is going down. So today you don't really trust a brand anymore, and trust in people and people rating goes up. So that's what you see with like companies like TripAdvisor. I mean, today most people actually go to TripAdvisor first to find a hotel, and they don't trust like Marriott or the brand of an hotel to know if it's a good hotel. They're going to trust TripAdvisor. So clearly ratings matter, and if we look at the history of online ratings, it's quite interesting because it really started with rating stuff, right? So probably the first thing we rated online, so back like 10, 15 years ago, when the internet came along, we rated stuff. So we rated like a camera on Amazon. So it's really an object. Soon after that, we started to rate people, but people we haven't really met. So if you think of eBay or most of the marketplaces, even C2C marketplaces, where people sell stuff online, we end up rating people, but we never meet these people actually. What they do is they ship stuff. And what we rate is shipping, the quality of the product, and we rate a seller. And it's also a one-way rating system, because if you think of eBay, buyers rate sellers, but sellers don't rate buyers because they don't need to. So it's a one-way rating system. And if we think of communities like ours or Airbnb or these C2C marketplaces of services, it gets quite interesting, or Couchsurfing would be another example. You start to rate people that actually you've met, right? So in our community, people tend to spend like 3, 4, 5 hours together in a car. So, and it goes both ways. Passengers would rate drivers, drivers would rate passengers. So you're creating this very powerful rating system where you rate services and people, and you get like a very rich level of information in your ratings about who that person really is, like what they do, what they like, how good of a driver they are, and so on and so on. So that's the way ratings have evolved. And for us, the way we've grown the company, and I'll show some figures on how the community has grown as we rolled out these new features, there are really 3 pillars of trust that you build on top of your community. So your community is going to be essentially based on your social data. So it's like your members, their photo, the photo of their cars, photo of their apartment or whatnot. And then there are really 3 things you need to build on top, and that really unlocked ride sharing as an activity, but really unlocked the sharing economy at large. And what I'm saying is probably applies to, again, lots of companies like Airbnb, Couchsurfing, and many others. So the first one is the one we just described in the middle, ratings. So essentially, you need to create activity-based ratings in your community, so that essentially you gather that information about how good the drivers are, how good the passengers are, so that people start trusting each other. The other pillar of trust that's key actually in these communities, and that's a bit of a challenge, is what I call verifications. So today, I mean, as a third-party provider, or as a third-party marketplace, you need to guarantee that the information you provide is kind of true, that the members are really who they say they are. So today, for example, what we do is any new member, any new account is linked to a mobile phone number, it's linked to a Facebook account, it's linked to an email. So all these things sort of create more trust and more verification around the member. And of course, it's going to go beyond that, right? I mean, today you see companies like Airbnb are doing even ID checks, right? So you take a photo of your driving license, and it's going to match your driving license to your name, and it's going to say, okay, Nicolas is really Nicolas, and we know that guy. And then the third pillar that's really critical is transactions. So if people don't transact on your platform, and essentially you don't control the money flow, you don't really control what's going on. So you don't know who transacted what with who and where and when. So you have no way to create trust in the community and no way to create transparency. So as you really start to get all the transactions online, actually it enables lots of things. It enables additional verification, because now you have a bank account, you have a credit card from your members, so you know who they are. So in terms of trust and transparency, it's pretty strong. You have commitment, because people pay online, so you know that either they're going to show up for the ride or they're going to show up to rent the flat. And you also enable member support, right? Because suddenly you know exactly who transacted what, when, where, and you can have like a member support team to help essentially in case there is an issue. So I'll show you what happened to our community. So we started very much like a very basic community. So it was just like a social network, and we said, okay, it's pretty simple, guys. If you're a driver, you offer your seat. If you're a passenger, you contact the guys and you try to travel together. And we've been doing that for like 2-3 years, and it never really took off. I mean, it was very, very, very slow. And in 2009, we introduced online ratings, and the community really started to take off with online ratings. And over time, we also introduced a few verifications. So we said, okay, maybe we should verify the phone number, maybe we should verify the Facebook account. And the scale is a bit slided, but in 2011 and 2012, we introduced payments and more verifications, and the traffic really exploded. So that's when we've seen like a massive takeoff in the community, to the point where we transported 3 million people in the community in 2012, and we estimate that we'll transport about 10 million people in 2013, so which is pretty powerful. So for us, it was really interesting to see, like, as we rolled out these features in a community, and as we built trust and transparency through these features in a community, the activity just multiplied. So, and if we step back, I mean, it really matters, because trust is clearly linked to GDP and wealth. So there is like a very strong correlation between trust and wealth, and there are lots of surveys on that in most countries, when you ask, okay, do you trust your neighbor, or would you trust someone with $10 to go and do your grocery, you realize that the higher the GDP of the country, the higher the trust, and vice versa. So they're correlated, and that same theory applies to communities. I mean, if you create more and more trust in your community, the wealth and the transaction in the community is going to grow. So I guess for all the online communities, the more transparency, the more checks, the more ratings, the more sort of wealth and social information you can gather, probably the more transactions you're going to get. So just to finish, I mean, essentially, it's pretty fundamental, and it's pretty fundamental to all industry that now we call the sharing economy, or sometimes we call collaborative consumptions. And I've put some companies here that some of you would recognize, like TaskRabbit, Etsy, Airbnb, that are huge in the US. But lots of these companies were based on essentially online trust. So, and online trust is going to unlock all new era of on the web, which is the sharing economy. So on that note, I'll just talk about Trustman, which is a character actually we created, and you can go on the website betrustman.com, where it's just a fun story essentially we've done, and we gathered lots of data on our community on trust, and we asked people like all kind of questions like, How would you trust a driver with no information? How would you trust a driver with a verified phone number, with a picture, with ratings, and so on and so on? So I won't go through the details. There are lots of numbers, and it's a pretty interesting study, and we'll publish more studies like that on the community because it's interesting for us to share that with the rest of the community. But what it shows is essentially trust is enabled by accumulating signals. So there is nothing you can do, no single thing you can do in a community to create trust. It's just like a collection of signals you create in your community so that you have this trust and transparency. So on that note, that's it for me. I don't know if there are Q&As or if we move to the next speaker. Thanks.